Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our event today, which is entitled Better Together, Building Engagement Between Migration Research and Policy. My name's Andrew Geddes. I'm from the European University Institute in Florence, and here with a team of us who are working precisely on this question of trying to build better engagement between migration research and policy. And we're going to be talking about that in today's meeting. Just before we begin, just a couple of short housekeeping announcements. The event is being recorded. And so for those who are joining us online, you're of course very welcome. If you don't want to appear on a recording, please switch off your camera. And also for those in the room, only the speakers at the podium will be recorded. So just to inform you about that. Also, we'd encourage you, if you want to share your opinions, photos, anything you want to share from the meeting. We have a hashtag, as everything does nowadays, and you are, feel free if you're into that kind of thing to share your experiences at this event. And at the end of the meeting, we're going to offer kind of refreshments in the Salon d'Honneur, which I think is just very close to here. So I'm going to very briefly introduce the project and give you an idea of what it is that we're doing. But what I wanted to do is avoid using the words, well, I'm going to talk to you about our project, because I think everybody would run out of the room if I did that. What I want to do is talk to you about what we're actually doing in practical terms to try to build engagement between research evidence and policy. And I think it's very significant that we do that. And so just to give you a run through our agenda for today, how we're going to approach this. And here is the agenda. And there it is. So I'm going to talk very briefly about what the broad endeavor that we are working on together as a team of partners. We're then going to talk about what we call the Migration Research to Policy Engagement Hub, which our colleagues from the Migration Policy Group in Brussels have developed in collaboration with other partners to provide practical information advice on how to build stronger engagement. So it's a resource kit, which hopefully will be of use. But the whole point about these kind of exercises is it's designed to be collaborative. We depend on feedback, advice, guidance, and also practical insights that people can bring us from their own roles and organizations to inform what we're trying to do. What we will then have is a time for Q&A, so hopefully we'll get your feedback and advice on the Engagement Hub. 1 o'clock, we're going to move to a panel discussion with 3 speakers: Anna Strollenberg, MEP, Nikolai Nielsen from EU Observer, and Alberto Horst Neidhardt from the European Policy Centre, with the slightly provocative title, Information War, the Search for the Truth on Immigration. But that's going to be thinking about obviously the highly politicized context for debates about migration nowadays, where information, misinformation, and disinformation seem to exist in a rather unstable relationship. And so we're going to be getting the insights of some people who've really deeply engaged with these kind of questions. So what I wanted to do now is very briefly just talk to you about the project itself and what we're trying to do. So what we are trying to do in our project is build stronger engagement. And to do that, we are working together to create this Migration Research to Policy Collaboratory with the objectives, as we can see there, building capacity to engage with evidence, increasing the demand for evidence, incentivizing engagement with evidence, and increasing the uptake of evidence. So what we're fundamentally interested in is of a terms of engagement, how engagement can be strengthened between those who do research, and we appreciate that people do research in many different capacities. So we are not talking only about academic research. Many organizations produce knowledge about migration and try and use that knowledge to influence policies and practices. And they do so from a very local level through to international levels. What we're trying to do is understand how engagement works from the local level through to the international level, and the many organizations that are involved in producing evidence, knowledge, information about migration, and how engagement can occur, and what can be the ways in which engagement is facilitated, and what also can be the obstacles to engagement. Now, how we're doing that is through a resource that we've created. Now, what often happens in these kind of projects is that the output occurs at the end of a project, but this is a project where we have created our key resource at the beginning of the project. And it's something called the Migration Research to Policy Co-Lab. And it has these 4 elements, but the kind of motivation for it is I think is quite an important motivation, because there has been a very significant investment in migration research in recent years. So around 160 million euros have been invested in around 56 large-scale EU-funded migration research projects since 2014. That's a significant investment in migration research. Yet we know, and I think many people here might also know, there's a troubled relationship between research and policy. So the production of knowledge about research and actual on-the-ground policy. And so what we are doing is trying to address that. We're not engaged in magical thinking and imagining that what we could do is resolve this and policy would be only informed by research. Of course, research is one voice in often at times a noisy room. So we kind of have to be kind of realistic in how we understand the relationship between research and policy. But what we're trying to do, or what we are doing, is creating this co-lab. It's a collaborative facility, and it relies upon engagement, people who want to engage with us, share their ideas and insights, and contribute to the development of a resource. It has these 4 elements, the first of which is a research exchange. So if you do get the chance to go to migrationresearchtopolicy.eu, which is our easy to remember URL, you will find that the research exchange contains information about all the large-scale EU-funded projects that have occurred over the last 10 years. And we'll continue to build that resource focused on large-scale international collaborative projects on migration. What we also do is encourage projects to share their findings in concise formats, up to around 800 words. We call these research shorts, equivalent to blogs. But we are working with projects to encourage them to share their findings in concise ways, around 800 words for the findings, and linking to other material for people who want to dig more deeply. The second element, which is what we're going to talk about today, led by our colleagues at the Migration Policy Group, is the Engagement Hub. That's a toolkit of resources built from the practical experiences of people engaged in research about how to build engagement from project design all the way through to project communication. And you'll find out a little bit about that in the next few minutes from our colleagues at MPG. We've also created a training facility. And last week, we organized a training at the EUI in Florence for around 29 participants, which was focused on the question of how researchers in various capacities, so not just academic researchers, how researchers can build engagement with policy. And we'll run other trainings as well, all linked to these purposes of building more effective relationships between evidence and policy. And finally, what we will do is test engagement in what we call process innovation actions, which are essentially pilot projects where what we do is in areas such as city-level responses to large-scale displacement, migrant self-employment, intergovernmental dialogue, protecting children in migration. What we'll do is kind of try to build engagement with evidence with key stakeholders. And so that will be the task which we undertake for the next year or so with the project. And we're also interested in taking the effect of engagement to more at a behavior level for response, evidence and information. So that will also complement the work we do as we try and build better understanding of engagement. But all of that can be found at the Migration Research to Policy website that we've created. We'd encourage you to engage with that. Obviously, thank you a lot. Thanks very much for attending today. And what I'd like to do now is hand over to Alexander Wolfhard from Migration Policy Group, who's going to talk to us about the Engagement Hub.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Andrew, for introducing the project and the CoLab. I just want to share this website right away here. If you're joining us today from a policymaker background, actually the research exchange that you mentioned may be especially interesting for you. That was launched actually already last year, but just to flag it briefly. This is the research exchange where you will find in the database research results, very accessible for policymakers. What are the key results of especially EU-funded projects? But of course, what we want to launch today is the Engagement Hub, which really is targeted to the research community, which is about how to engage with policymakers, how to communicate and disseminate results, how to bring evidence to decision making, how to produce research that is impactful, that is more policy relevant. And clearly, there is a need for this kind of guidance. We all know how challenging that often is. We are working here in policy fields, migration integrations that are very polarized. Often we think when we hear policy proposals, whether this is based on evidence at all. So clearly there is a need for this sort of guidance. But then when we started to work on the toolkit, we also thought, okay, what would be most useful for the research community? Because actually there is already a lot of stuff out there. You just have to Google these topics. You will find a lot of material. The Joint Research Center, partner in the project, for example, has produced a research to policy handbook. So it's not really rocket science. But what we found, what really is often needed to get into it and to make it more everyday practice in the research process is the concrete example, the good practice, the experience of colleagues who are doing this a lot, the little tips and tricks, and then a way to make this accessible easily. So this is exactly how we built this toolkit. We collected the good practice that exists in the INNOVATE partnership, which is bringing together universities, think tanks, organizations that are combining research with advocacy, ICMBD, advising governments. So there is a lot of knowledge here. And what we did was in a collaborative effort to look what are the good practices, what works for us, to bring it together in an online toolkit, an online resource, draw conclusions and derive general recommendations from these good practices, and share it. So this is now how it looks, our toolkit. And I have to say thank you at this point to everyone who has contributed. Some of the co-authors are here with us today. Thank you also to the graphic design team at the EUI. Thank you to our communications team at MPG. So it's structured into 6 sections. Understand your audience, building relationship and trust. Oh, this is happening again. Tailoring research to policymakers' needs, stakeholder engagement for policy change, and then 2 sections on reaching policymakers, content and messages, and 1 more on timing tools and channels. If we then open just one of these chapters here on stakeholder engagement, you will find the set of general recommendations, for example, on methods of stakeholder engagement, or ethical considerations in engagement. And then below, you will find these good practices. Where in this case, we have 6 good practices. For example, something on the engagement cycle provided by ACRE, including migrants and storytelling in research dissemination, contributed by TU Chemnitz. Something on design thinking, University of Luxembourg, deliberative polling, EUI, multi-stakeholder engagement at the local level from the University of Warsaw. And in these good practices, tested that before. You will find a short introduction into the good practice. What are the basic principles here? And then step by step, what needs to be done. And then we have this, and this is now an example from the International Rescue Committee, a practical example how these methods were applied in a specific research project, where you will find engagement steps again, how it was done, success factors, impact and lessons learned, and then learn more links to additional resources. Now, if you look again at the overall range of topics that are included in this toolkit, what I think is quite interesting to see is that actually a lot can be said and must be said about all the stages in a research process that come before the moment you have your content, your results, and you start the outreach, and you think about the policy recommendations and your policy briefs, and then how to get into policy dialogue, which actually is only chapters 5 and 6 of this toolkit. Everything else comes before. So it's about very early in the entire research cycle to start thinking about or to understand the audience in the first place and think about what is the policy context. Do a power mapping actually of the stakeholders. What are the positions of policymakers? How is it evolving? When actually is the best moment to reach out and engage with policymakers? Then later on, when you're at the stage of tailor your research to the needs of policymakers, try to meet them early on in the research process, listen to them. What are the bottlenecks? What are the specific research interests? This is not to compromise your academic freedom. This is more to understand and then better adapt the research and to make it more relevant. Stakeholder engagement for policy change. The whole chapter is about how to bring in the other policy stakeholders, civil society actors, migrant-led organizations, migrants themselves, research. So that chapter is also interesting for research, but also for stakeholders. So maybe that is a main takeaway toolkit, that it's so much more than just the dissemination and communication part that very often comes at the very end of research projects, and that actually engaging with policymakers and thinking about how to bring the research into decision-making should be part of the research design right from the beginning. And maybe there's also a message here for the implementation of Horizon projects in future. Last remark, as you said, this is just the launch version of the toolkit. We compiled it in a very early stage of the INNOVATE project because we are now starting with these process innovation actions. where we want to test and explore the methods. So there's also an element of mutual learning here in the project. And then what comes out of these innovation actions will again feed into this toolkit with all the materials and insights. So this is just a quick overview of the toolkit. As I said, we are happy that some of the authors are here today, some are online. I would now ask you to come on stage. My colleague Juris will have a few questions for you to kick off the questions and answers session. And I'm quite sure that we will have a lot of questions and comments from our audience.
Thank you, Alex. I will briefly introduce our partners who've been contributing to the toolkit today and present today to answer some of our questions, but also hopefully questions from the audience. So we have Martin Wagner from ICMPD. We have Johannes Glöckner from University of Technology Chemnitz in Germany. Yeah, sorry. We have Jutta Bissinger from University of Luxembourg. We have Flamina Delle Cese from the International Rescue Committee, Italy. And we have Dr. Meltem İneli Geir, Süleyman Demirel University in Turkey. Managed it. Thank you for being here. And I would like to open with a question firstly to Martin. At ICMPD is an organization which has policymakers in its mind as one of the main target audiences. What would you highlight as 3 key insights to understand your audiences and what are their research needs? So if you can bring maybe your 3 major findings.
Is this the bottom? Yeah, this is the right one. Yeah, thank you. And also thanks to invite us for this panel. And indeed, ICMPD as an intergovernmental organization, our constituency is consisting of ministerial officials. And I guess this is broadly when we speak about policymakers. And therefore, yes, we have a regular exchange with so-called policymakers, but this brings me actually to my first point. This is, I would not we very often have in projects, we reach out to policymakers, and I always wonder who the policymaker is. So I think it's clear and the obvious to state that it's not one homogeneous group, but there are actually very different levels. And we already heard it in the introduction from Alexander. I think this is a consideration from the outset of a research project. Also, whom do I want to target? Municipality level, state level, EU level. Then I think also very important is the personal decision maker. Can they do decision or is an advisor? Completely different group. Is it a political position? Is it a ministerial position? So the policymaker, very surprising to you, I guess, is not existing. But there are very different levels. But I think important, and it was a bit mentioned already, is with understanding the audience means also to understand a bit how does the workplace look? What is on the desk of a person right now? Does my research contribute to this? What is on the table right now? And I think we referred very often in the project to timeliness. The more timely your research is, the more entry you have. And very often we had also in research that we conducted for this, we also very often heard, a bit strange, that was such a good product, but it wasn't taken up. Probably it was not yet the time. Probably there will come another time for that. That's more relevant. And my last point would be probably to keep it brief. I think also very often it's good to know upfront whether the person aligns with my research or not, just to have a bit of an understanding with what kind of message I can go out. if my research findings do not find the probably political background of the person with whom I meet, I might probably take another tone in one way or the other, which might be quite useful to gain trust, I guess. Yeah. This would be my very quick 3 points.
Thank you, Martin. Much appreciated. And always the golden rule: know your audience, understand who they are, what they do, what their needs. So it's not only in research, but I mean basically in all our activities. And my next question I would like to address to Johannes. At your university, you have established long-term relationship with policymakers, decision makers, and maybe you can share 3 examples of the specific examples of how you maintain, how you establish those relationships, maybe to share with the audience.
Thank you. Thank you for the question and also for the invitation, of course. Yeah, it's we focused the last years in the Technical University of Chemnitz under the leadership of Birgit Glorius, especially on research in the eastern part of Germany, and there especially on small-sized localities. And one aspect I want to mention to engage policymakers and stakeholders is, first of all, and Alexander, you already mentioned, is the work before doing the research. So the good selection of case studies of localities is an important aspect, I think, because it takes work, and you shouldn't underestimate the work which has to be done before starting the research project. So I think it's important not to underestimate this. Also, what you already mentioned, get familiar with the context is something very important to start to build trust and to find especially spaces of dialogue which already exist. So we heard in our interviews we did in the INNOVATE project as well, how important is the use of spaces of existing spaces of dialogue, because stakeholders and policymakers are already in touch with each other. And it's a good entry point to start the discussion or start the dialogue. And a second point I want to mention is to attract stakeholders and policymakers with your research, and to build trust. A good start is, of course, to do, for example, expert interviews, because then you have a familiar framework and a little bit intimate conversation where stakeholders can start opening and start to discuss and really to find what you already mentioned, find out a little bit the room of maneuver they have really to work with. And for this, I think another point is what I think is very important is to enable safe spaces during the entire research project to facilitate the exchange and keep the privacy and make sure that stakeholders really can express themselves, especially in times of changing discourses and changing political situations. I think it's an important aspect. And that one was already as well in the presentation a little bit, is the stream of the project to overcome the project logics and to enable a constant stream of information to maintain relations with stakeholders, a constant flow of research projects is very important. Yeah.
Thank you, Johannes, for sharing. And just a reminder that, of course, within the toolkit, you will find elaborated versions and more examples of good practices of the methods employed by our presenters today. And my next question is to Jutta. At your university, you're employing a particular method of design thinking to involve both policymakers and young migrants. What would you identify as the main 3 success factors of success that make this useful process, make this approach useful in policy making and bringing together with the audience?
Thank you. Yes, we employed the design thinking method in a previous Horizon project, MIMI, and it was with young migrants and policymakers, but also stakeholders like youth workers, so they are who are engaged in supporting young migrants. It was done in Luxembourg, but also in several other European countries. And I would say the three main important aspects for success is really the setting. So to really ensure a very open, friendly and safe environment, and also to really make clear that there are no hierarchies and that it's really a bottom-up approach. So like it's very important to consider who's the facilitator or facilitators, depending on how many participants you aim to involve, and as well, for example, in Luxembourg, often the multilingual setting, so you might need translators as well. So also there to make sure that you not exclude some participants. So for us in Luxembourg, it was really possible to involve directly national policymakers from several ministries. In other countries, depends a bit, that might be more difficult. We got, especially from the policymakers, a very positive feedback on that. The second point I would say is to really seek to understand deeply and to really try to understand the perspectives of the others. So that's from the design thinking logic. You find it in the toolkit. There's also short on the website, so you will find more information in case you're not familiar with it. But so it's really to challenge yourself from the beginning when someone decides to participate, but also the facilitators need to make that very clear. So there it's also like you really need to know the audience before and might consider who you really want to invite. And the third aspect we learned from it when testing it there is really to also think already from the beginning of potential follow-up meetings, or if possible, even find regular workshops like this, so that we were also directly asked for, and sometimes that might be more difficult in a project setting, but it's also important to think of it and potentially plan already from the beginning a strategy paper or a declaration. So any kind of product or anything you then actually also want to co-create together. Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think nobody will dispute how important in terms of research, bringing actually different parties together and giving sometimes somewhat maybe abstract subject a real face and real connection, which completely changes perspective. My next question is to Flomina. And at International Rescue Committee, you combine research with targeted engagement and advocacy. And when you're launching a report, maybe you can share 3 tips on for getting the dialogue started with the policymakers. What would be your kind of main pointers and tips?
Thanks for the question, and thanks for having us here today. So the first point would be to actually start one step back. So even before the launch, thinking of how to engage with policymakers since the beginning of your work, whatever you're doing research or writing a report or whatever other piece that you want to publish, because that gives you the opportunity to set the ground together, establish what your objectives are, and possibly already find a common ground, if there's any, from that stage, so that they're not surprised in a way when the report or any other piece comes out. We did this in our experience with a report that took 1 year of work, and eventually we understood that this early engagement was really appreciated by the stakeholders. It might not always be the case, but in that case, it did work. The second point would be to find a hook, and Martin already touched upon that. So try to see and highlight as much as possible how your research, your report fits within the political agenda, within the political priorities of the policymakers. Of course, you have to know your audience, again, as you were saying, and really showcasing how what you have found aligns with their own priorities. And the hook also means finding potentially time-related hook. So again, in our experience with this report that I was mentioning that took 1 year, almost 1 year of work, we decided to wait 1 month more before publishing it, because this would mark the 1 year since a certain policy had been introduced. So it was a way also to have the door open from the policymakers saying, okay, this is a 1 year landmark since this policy was in. How do we assess it together? And finally, the most important point, I think, would be recommendations, clear recommendations that are addressed as specific stakeholders and that are also actionable, so that the policymaker, the stakeholder you're targeting, knows what they have to do, how, and it's something that they can act on and that you can also follow up, as Jutta was also mentioning. And the recommendations should also be a way for you to back them all, meaning that the practitioner, the advocate, has to really explain what is the rationale behind each recommendation and what is the impact that the recommendation will have if implemented. And I think this is really the most important part, because sometimes it is what is lacking now from a great product, then what is the action that is needed to address the issue.
Thank you very much, Fomin. And I think this is really added value of this particular project and the tool we're launching today, of bringing different players who have different perspectives and sometimes aims, but and different experiences were incredibly useful. So hopefully it will enrich our audiences in when starting on a journey with a specific project to bear in mind those valuable contributions from different perspectives. And my last question to Melton, in the context of your work with the new organization, you regularly engage policy makers, decision makers, and practitioners at very different level. So I would ask you a little bit more about communications, and what would be your 3 major tips you would give in how best to engage with your audience?
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Jutta. Good afternoon. So in my capacity as an associate professor of international law at the Süleyman Demirel University, I actually get to work with a lot of different stakeholders. First, I work in many projects with international organizations in Turkey. They are Turkish officers. I also engage with EU institutions and national migration authorities of the member states in relation to the Temporary Protection Directive and temporary protection of Ukrainians. But I do a lot of capacity building and trainings with the Turkish presidency of migration management. I also work with refugee rights NGOs and do public speaking with refugees. So all these different stakeholders, I think, having been involved with different projects, I can recommend mostly to researchers and academic 3 things. First, if you're a researcher just starting out, and I see a lot of young colleagues in the room as well, I would recommend identifying an original topic and on the research topic that is already policy relevant, or that may become policy relevant in the future. So after this identification, do the research well, publish quality research outputs, and also try as much as possible engage with the policymaker beginning. In one of the teams, practice with the MPG. In my experience in mostly projects, what I did before is this. Ask a high-level politician or policymaker final conference to present over years and years of work. Well, in my experience, this rarely works. Why? Because this high-level politician or a policymaker comes, delivers the keynote speech or does the plenary speech, and then leaves with the entourage. They rarely wait and listen all the academic presentations in and what you have done all these years. And this is right, so because we know that policymakers are pressed for time, they might not have the patience as academics do to listen hours and hours of research as well. So a key theme here, and I want to emphasize, is that include them to the planning if this is possible. It may not be possible, but ask them, I am planning to do this project or research project. Will this be of interest to you? If I change the design or if I change the outputs, would this be more interesting for you? What can you get out of it? And just ask these questions, get the feedback, get the comments, try to incorporate them to the research. And let me also say, I don't believe that all academics should do research on policy relevant topics. We should be free to, do research on whatever we want. But if you want to produce something that can impact policy, and I think it's important as one stage for academics as well, just get their feedback in the beginning, if possible. Inviting them in the last and final stages of research rarely works. And of course, then you need to, if possible, build a trusted relationship with them. And this is one of the key themes that we have also mentioned in the key, toolkit. I have done, and I have been involved in a lot of commissioned research. I think this is one of the target areas where you can make an impact because the policymakers are asking a particular thing from you and they expect results. If you do your job good, you kind of produce really quality research. You also know your target audience, their educational background, their seniority, their institution's priorities. These things change how you present a research. So if you do your research well, if you target your key messages in a concise and clear way, target your message to depending on which policymaker you are speaking with, I think, and you do it over the years, like me, sometimes you become also friends, it gets easier and more manageable. And I think you are more likely to have an impact. That's it.
Wonderful, very good summary and tips. And I think it's very important to highlight, particularly in this context when we're talking about policy-specific research, because obviously academics should be and choose whatever subject they would like to research and work on. But if we're talking about policy-specific context, the context is very specific, where you need to really understand your audiences, who they are, which level they work, which competences, what are the points of entries, establishing relationship, but also tailoring the message and the way of approaching. So thank you very much once again to all of you for taking your time and presenting your main points. And we now would like to open the floor to our audience here in Brussels, but also to our online guests. So if I just raise your hand and we'll come with you with a microphone. If you're following us online, just put your question in the chat and we will monitor and give you a floor to raise your questions. So yes, I saw a hand. If you just state your name, maybe in where you're coming from in terms of your institution, organization. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Hi. Thank you for this presentation. I think it was very insightful for all of us working in research. I'm here today under two hats. So one with the Quaker Council of European Affairs, and then the other, the Migration, Youth and Children platform. So I have two questions. The first one being, when we're talking about actionable recommendations, how do we answer to such when we're working on more theoretical research that is perhaps based on certain philosophical theorists, and therefore, I guess, it's more concepts and notions as opposed to implicating very specific actionable recommendations? That's my one question. And my second question, it has to do with stakeholder engagement. As youth, I think one of our main issues that we face is obviously not having the relevance in a lot of, especially, I mean, obviously in this field, migration policy management. So as a quote unquote non-important stakeholder, how do we make ourselves more relevant and to really prove to policy makers that youth have a stake in this, and as opposed to, for example, youth consultations being more like a tick off. So instead of them just, okay, well, we will include youth in this dialogue because youth needs to be there, but going further than that and ensuring that we're not indeed just present for the sake of saying that youth or other marginalized communities, for example, are also present in these dialogues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just one question. Is it a general question to all panel, or do you want to target somebody specifically?
And then the second one, I think everyone can.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. So I can answer the first question maybe partly because I don't have an academic background. I'm a lawyer and legal and advocacy advisor. And the typical way that the International Rescue Committee works is that we do program-based advocacy, evidence-based advocacy. So it's very, very practical. What we do also as well, nevertheless, is really to study the processes that we want to influence. So to know how the system works in theory and try to tie as much as possible the recommendations to those systems. So whenever something is very abstract, we really try to concretize it as much as possible. So let's maybe provide you with an example. When we had to work on access to the asylum system in Italy, and this is something that actually is included in the toolkit as an example. Of course, there is the legal theory of how it should work and what the law says, what the national law, the EU law, and so on and so forth. But then that explaining that to the stakeholders leaves them with the question like, okay, so how do I do what you're recommending to do? And instead, what we did is really try to put the people at the center, showcase the impact that the fact that they were not respecting those sets of laws was having on the people. So we talked to them, we saw the struggle that they were having, and really provided kind of a step-by-step guide of how the stakeholders could address the issue and increase and make better the situation for the people that were directly affected. So we try to tie as much as possible to the concrete setting in which we operate. And by concrete setting, I really mean the actual location, maybe not even nationwide, but even citywide or, area of the citywide. And we try also to tie as much as possible to the people that are impacted. But maybe my academics colleague will have additional answers from the other part, let's say, of the question.
No, I actually thought more about the second question, but maybe to the first, I think that's really a challenge. And in the MIMI project, which actually focused on young migrants, that's why I will also then say something on a second question. But we had this also very theoretical concept, and it was very hard to actually translate that into really actionable recommendations. And at some point we also thought, okay, maybe that's not so important in this case. So I think it's also very important that there are researchers focusing on very theoretical concepts, and they might really not be of relevance for policymakers, and that's okay. I think we also have to accept that partly. And to your other question, so I only wanted to say that previous Horizon project MIMI, it was a 3 years project, but it ended in 2023. But it was really focusing on young migrants, and then also argument. Actually, they got some research in general. Maybe sometimes also whatever recommendations, then they might be maybe general when it comes to the age. So we tried to really target what are the needs of young migrants, and then we brought them also in these design thinking workshops really directly together with the policymakers, and it was really from both sides, I think, a very valuable setting, because it was also, I think, for some of the policymakers really nothing they have done before. But so I think to really increase that, I mean, maybe it would be really to have these kind of youth labs or really regularly. And so I think there's still a lot to be done. But thank you for the question. I think it's really an important one.
Thank you very much for the question. Thank you very much for the answers. I would like, maybe because we are also a little bit tight on time, I would like to raise the question which was posted on our Zoom call, which is actually about inclusion of a global South perspectives and people in the development of the school toolkit. And maybe I would target particularly Andrew and Alex, something to say about this particular issue?
Well, I'd be it's a very important point. I can't quite read the name of the person who made it, but two of our pilot projects, we call them process innovation actions, are going to be focused on developments outside of Europe, because I think one of the things that's very relevant is 160 million euros has been spent on migration research, and that's consolidated a knowledge base within the European Union, but then how does, whether that is integrated insights from the global south, I think is still an open question. So one of our, an important member of our team is Linda Ucho, who leads the Africa Migration Development Policy Center in Nairobi. We're planning work on migration, mobility, gender in East Africa, and we're also doing some work around climate change, migration and mobility as well. But I think the challenge is a really significant one for all researchers that's been highlighted there. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. I don't know if Alex, you would like to add something.
Just as a comment, I remember when we worked on the toolkit and the good practices, I think with Linda, we especially talked about policy recommendations, also in the context of an African country, and how important it is to be realistic within certain constraints that are there, and how to address the challenges of staying in touch with very changing policymakers, new faces all the time. So that really also went into the toolkit, this perspective.
Thank you both. And I will use my power of moderation to, unfortunately, not allow any more questions, because we need to smoothly process to the next panel. And for that, we need to change in positioning and changing the names. But I would like to invite you not to leave the room, because we will start next panel literally in 4 minutes. Thank you.
I think we can, while we're doing the choreography of the panel, I'll introduce the panel. Because I think I don't know if the words elephant in the room are quite right, but obviously what hangs over this whole debate is the politicization of migration. So we're talking about migration research and evidence and policy in a context which is perhaps more, we know is very highly politicized. It's an issue that can cause significant and serious divisions in societies. We've seen very important, significant political mobilizations in Europe and, of course, in other parts of the world on migration. And so some people might think it's really naive to imagine that research evidence is going to inform policy when political agendas seem deeply entrenched. And that was kind of the inspiration to have a discussion which is extending what we were just talking about, which is evidence and policy and the work we're trying to do, to then think about, well, how does this relate to the broader context in which information, misinformation and disinformation all seem to exist together? And to do that, what we thought we'd do is get together a panel of people who perhaps bring in different kinds of perspectives. So we've heard from people involved in research. I think that's obviously really important for what we're trying to do as a project. But actually, how does that then relate to the lives and work and influence of people who are existing in this, I don't know how you would describe this, kind of this miasma of information, misinformation and disinformation, high levels of politicization, high levels of contestation. And some people seem to be very angry about these issues, and it's motivating their behavior, politically their behavior. So that was where we wanted to go with this panel discussion. I'm really pleased that 3 excellent speakers accepted our invitation to participate. So in the order we see in front of us, Anna Strollenberg, member of the European Parliament, very welcome. Nikolai Nielsen from EU Observer, and Alberto Horst-Neidhardt from the European Policy Centre. So it's a great mix, I think, if you excuse me, because I have a memory of a goldfish, so I have to write these things down. But what I wanted to do was put some questions to the members of our panel. So the idea will be, I'm going to ask a couple of questions to each member of a panel. They'll respond for 3 or 4 minutes, but that will also leave time again for Q&A, both for people in the room and for people online. So feel free to engage. So I wanted to start first with Anna, if that's okay, because you're very involved in public debate about migration in your role as an elected representative. And so I'd be very interested to get your view on the impact that misinformation and disinformation can have on public debate. And do you see the impacts of misinformation, disinformation in what you do as an elected representative and on how it can affect decision making?
Thank you, first of all. And my answer is a definite yes. Because I'm a member of the Greens and I focus on migration-related topic, both asylum and labor migration. And last summer, the government in the Netherlands fell on the topic of migration, and we were flooded with disinformation, I have to say. Everywhere you could read messages on saying that asylum seekers would get everything for free, healthcare, a house, money, everything, and that most people entering the Netherlands are asylum seekers. Although if we look at the numbers, it's 12% of the people coming to the Netherlands as asylum seekers, 52 is EU citizens, a majority of people is family reunification. So the numbers apparently don't seem to matter anymore. And it was blown up, also out of proportion, also I have to say by media outlets by then. Back then, I still worked for the Dutch Council for Refugees, so I was not in this position yet. So it was not last summer, but before. And we started this whole campaign about debunking myths. And we saw that it worked for some people that were interested in the topic. And for others, it didn't work. They would just shove the numbers aside. And now in the European Parliament, I see the same. Like the majorities changed in the Parliament, and the Parliament has become more conservative, and these narratives have become more popular. If we talk about migrants, it's always about criminals, about securitization, and almost never again about human rights, for example. Now, a while ago, last week, the Commission came up with the new proposals on return. And we also asked questions because there's no impact assessment, so we don't know what the effect will be. And I think this is a clear example of people having this feeling, politicians acting out of their gut feeling, and then we're coming up with proposals that there's no evidence that it will work. And I think this is a very worrying sign, and we're trying to tackle it, but I'm afraid that this is going to be the reality the upcoming period.
Great, thank you very much. And I want to move to Nikolai because, you know, as we know, immigration is high on the political agenda. Policy is fast moving. As we arrived, you're focused on what might be the agenda for today and how that affects your role as a journalist. There's a constant stream of information and news, and we know it's of varying reliability and quality. So I was wondering if you could provide examples from the work you do as a reporter for EU Observer, focus on migration issues, how you try to navigate this explosion of information, misinformation and disinformation.
I mean, I've been reporting on migration, EU Observer, since 2012, and I would say this explosion of disinformation nothing new. I mean, I've seen migrants depicted as people who abuse the social welfare system already in 2012, that they're blamed for high unemployment, wage deflation. They're also blamed for undermining the European identity. They're blamed for what else? Also undermining or challenging or threatening religious traditions here in Europe. And often their arrivals are framed as some sort of invasion. Now it's also framed as a security threat, especially when it comes from Belarus. But here in Brussels, what I find challenging is, plausible arguments mixed with spin, and I would say half-truths, yeah? So that's, I find somewhat challenging. I can give you some examples of that, maybe some context. You might remember last May, the EU adopted its Pact on Asylum and Migration. Skinnes at the time had described it as a house with 3 floors. The first floor is the external dimension of migration when it comes to countries of origins and transit, the deals that it entails. The second floor was shoring up the external borders, and the third floor was some sort of variation of solidarity among member states. So less than 48 hours later, 15 member states issued a joint statement about the need for, let's say, innovative solutions, out-of-the-box thinking when it comes to asylum. And so it makes you wonder if Skinnes's house metaphor is built on shifting sand. And it's also the first time I saw the term return hub mechanism. And this is where the euphemism used by the EU begins to emerge. For me, it's basically offshoring detention, prison-like camps. They can call it return hubs if they want. And this is where the spin comes in. You might recall that the European Commission had described the hotspots on the Greek islands as effective and efficient, a beating heart of migration policy. And then Moria happened, burned down in a fire. MSF at the time said that children under the age of 10 were threatening to commit suicide. So if this kind of concept doesn't work on an EU territory, open and free society, a democracy, then how can we expect these return hubs to work with full respect of fundamental rights via bilateral deals with member states abroad? So another thing that I find challenging is when it comes to numbers and statistics, especially when it comes to arrivals. And again, here we have half-truths. And I would say the Commission is guilty of this, at least in my experience. So for instance, last December, von der Leyen announced that the reason why arrival numbers have decreased is because of EU policy and because of its cash for migrant deals with Tunisia. It's plausible, but is it accurate? So when I ask, for instance, the IOM has a sort of a global data analysis unit, so data scientists tasked to understand what these figures mean. Well, they tell me, wait a minute, it's only half the picture. We can't make any sort of determination for the reason why arrival numbers drop like they do, because it also depends on what's happening in the countries of origin and the countries of transit. But this is sort of the narrative that I'm faced. So like half-truths, spin, euphemisms, and plausible arguments. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Nikolai. So moving to you, Alberto. A few years ago, you published something on the topic of disinformation and misinformation, and you wrote, and I quote, "Disinformation about migration is increasingly being employed to disrupt and sow divisions in Europe. Across the EU, myths about the number of migrant arrivals, their economic impact, or their propensity for crime are strategically promoted and exploited to influence public opinion with serious political implications." And we've also already heard about this. And so do you think that things have changed since you wrote that 5 years ago? And if so, in which direction?
Thanks, Andrew. And first of all, good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Have they changed? In a way, some of the trends that we had identified back in 2020 have consolidated, and also picking up on what you two have already brought to the table. I have to say, it seems to me that disinformation actors and a number of other political agents have, in a way, refined their strategies and their tactics. Essentially, when you look at the narratives that circulate online now, they come out of what is effectively a toolkit that can be adapted to different news cycles and different contexts. But I also wanted to pick up and respond to your provocative title for this panel, and I'll try to be a bit provocative. And I would say that disinformation actors are in a way already winning the battle of the narratives. And I think they are winning it for several reasons. I'll mention 3, but maybe other reasons will come to mind, but I also hope somebody will challenge me. First, because I think they have learned very effectively how to use or mix real life events with disinformation to keep the salience of migration high in the political debate. They also, when looking at the responses, there's an overemphasis on fact-checking everything that circulates online, regardless of the impact that individual stories, misleading information actually has on the public debate, which means that the public is oftentimes cognitively overloaded. And so you will find situations where citizens are exposed, on the one hand, persistently to disinformation and misinformation, linking immigration to high criminal rates. And at the same time, they will be explained that, of course, scientific evidence demonstrates the opposite. And in this context, what happens is the narratives, the threat-based narratives that underlie disinformation become normalized, as you were both saying. But the third point, and I think this is quite important, that it relates to the overall objective of the project. I find that in a way, instead of addressing the economic and social concerns that motivate people to pay attention to disinformation and its content, the focus of policymakers remains very much on surface level solutions. And so in many cases, I would argue, policymakers have failed to address the underlying issues that fuel people's interest in threat-based narratives. And I'm being provocative here, but many people feel that their deep-seated concerns and anxieties are going unnoticed. And so one of the points that we raised back in 2020 is that if you really want to preempt disinformation from having an impact on the public debate, you also have to take very seriously the concerns that actually raise its attention. You're not going to be able to eliminate the problem about disinformation on migrants stealing jobs or stealing housing or driving immigration criminal rates up, unless you actually deal with unemployment, unless you deal with housing and lack of housing and segregation. And unfortunately, my assessment is that from 2020, we haven't really sufficiently learned this lesson.
Thank you, Alberto. So I think that first round of questions were very much focused on the kind of the problem and the scale of the problem. And I think we found, and I'd hardly be surprised if people in the room or joining us online, but it is significant. And the experiences, I think, are really powerful in demonstrating that. With the second round, just to alert everybody, there will be Q&A. So we would, if you got things you'd like, please, gather your thoughts we'll have a Q&A. But what we wanted to do in the second round was move on to a solution, a bit of a simplistic way of putting it, but ways of perhaps countering misinformation and disinformation. And so I wanted to start with Anna as an elected representative member of the European Parliament, and I suppose how you try and engage around these issues in the work that you do. And so do you think there are ways to use evidence and information to the public in ways that could maybe take some of the heat out of the immigration issue and perhaps help address some of the polarization that we see?
Yes, this is, I have to be honest, one of the most difficult points that we have, that we're all facing with, dealing with. I think, Alberto, you have a very fair point. I don't think it's provocative at all. It is one of the realities. And I can only talk about my own country, the Netherlands, where we have a major housing crisis. So I can keep yelling, oh, it's not the refugees' fault, but if we don't fix it, people will still feel it. And the image is already there. So to keep or take that image away once it's there, it's very hard. So we are currently deploying different strategies. First of all, sometimes we think we should talk about it less. It's a bit sad, but every time we fuel this debate, the people on more the far right side will win the debate because it's easy and it's easier to spread hate. So sometimes I try to talk about it less. On the other hand, I do find it important, especially in this changing environment, to be the voice for human rights, to still stand for our values. So I'll do so, but I mainly, I do it a lot behind the scenes when I'm talking to the Commission. I'm also part of this monitoring group of the implementation of the pact, and there we always raise it. And then I have a different approach, and that is that I'm currently working on this vision for talent. So how can we develop talent in the whole of the EU? How can we reskill and upskill people that are currently here? How can we include women in the jobs of the future? And how can we also make sure that people from abroad come here and get a proper job based on their skill level? So to try to not talk about migration, but more of a holistic approach on talent. I don't know yet if this will work, but this is something that we're trying right now. So it's a mix of different methods. But also, again, be honest, and I haven't found what we say that's the golden egg yet. So this is something we have to keep working on.
Thank you. So turning to Nikolai, from perspective working in a media organization, and I was struck by just reading about what was happening in the US, where obviously things have proceeded in a ways maybe could have been predicted, but the pace is remarkable. But I suppose there've been some reporting recently about developments. I think it was in California, where in response to Trump's executive orders and the ICE enforcement that we're seeing in the US, the emergence of local non-profit newsrooms, so developing toolkits, publishing resource guides, helping to train people in media literacy, and using kind of media networks to help build trust and enable newsrooms to connect and resonate with their readers and their views. Sometimes readers perhaps hard to reach through traditional channels. So, do you think that kind of experience in the US is relevant to Europe, or do you think there are other things that could be done in terms of the news and media environment?
I think what's happening in the United States is also in part in response to Donald Trump and his administration. He's an authoritarian. I would say he's like a casino mob boss, and that terrifies a lot of people in the United States, but also here. I mean, he's dismantled now Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, which also has an impact on journalists here. So I think the problem we have in Europe as far as media and how to address it is a little bit different. What I see here is more of a compassion fatigue. I would say a normalization of death even doesn't really strike the nerve as it used to when we see stories of people dying at sea or trying to cross land borders from Turkey to Bulgaria or Greece. This is something that wasn't always the case here. And I'm not sure what the response is to that and how to deal with that. How many can remember the Polish shipwreck? 650 people died. And the wheels of justice seem to turn very slowly or not at all when those who die have skin that is the color, well, not white, but brown and black. And what does that say about the society we live in? I mean, last December, 3 boys from Egypt, two of them only 15 years old, froze to death in the forests of Bulgaria. One of them was partially eaten by animals. This is happening, I'm not saying daily, but it happens a lot. Doesn't make headline news anymore. So I think there's something else going on. So yeah, that's that point. I also think another problem we have is the illusion of truth. I think repetition tends to make a fact seem more true, even if it's not entirely true. I remember Donald Tusk, when he was president of the council, came forward with a one-page white paper where he said that mandatory relocations was a dead end. And instead, he proposed for more EU funding on returns, increase of shoring up external borders, more funding for migration deals with third countries. And then he had said that this all threatens the Schengen border-free zone, right? So that was back in 2015. Now the similar arguments are still being made today, repeated over and over again. So now, at that time in 2015, the European Commission described Tusk's proposal as un-European because there's a solidarity clause in the treaty that we need to stick to. Now, von der Leyen is saying it's true. We need to increase and shore up the external borders in order to have a more free internal borders. If that's the case, then why, the European Commission had received something like 440 notifications when it comes to member states imposing internal border checks, and has only ever once issued an opinion to the contrary. So I'm not sure. So I suppose that's basically my point, if there is one in there. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Nicola. I think the illusion of truth is quite a powerful idea. I think there are many things, points have been raised that people might want to come back on and address. Thank you for that. And so a final question to the panel for Alberto, because you're working in a think tank and mobilizing knowledge and research and evidence is kind of your daily job. And I was thinking about the obstacles to actually using evidence, facts, and information for policy making, how you can perhaps give concrete examples from the work that you do in relation to kind of recent changes and reforms in the EU setting to kind of illustrate the challenges that you face.
Thanks, and I think it's a question that allows me also to pick up on some of the other things that you both brought up previously. And I think the question of why there's so little evidence-based output is a crucial question, and it's one that we are confronted by on a day-to-day basis. And I think the INNOVATE project is actually quite interesting because it addresses some of the key factors. And going back to something that was mentioned in the previous session, certainly there are not sufficient engagement opportunities, but I think it's also important to keep very much in mind the constraints which are embedded in the policymaking process. And so I can use some of the examples that were mentioned previously. So if you take into consideration the new pact and all the reforms that have happened afterwards, I think it is very clear that there are significant constraints. And so you can think of the effect of political pressure on the policymaking process, which essentially means that decisions must be made without thorough impact assessments. So that is a reality which is becoming also normalized in migration policymaking. So element is the urgency which is imposed by actors, certain priorities, means that if there is sufficient evidence, if this contradicts the pre-existing political priorities, it may not be sufficient to actually determine a change in direction or a change in policy preferences. And I think we need to take this very seriously, because from my perspective, this is becoming a new reality in migration policy making, and we need to reflect very carefully about opportunities for actually changing these dynamics. I do want to also point to the irony or the paradox of all of these, because first of all, because policies do not sufficiently take into account the evidence, they oftentimes lead to unintended effects or counterproductive effects, while at the same time inflating citizens' expectations, public expectations that something is being done about these problems. The second is, again, going back to the legislative process at the EU level, the value of swift decision-making is taking priority above everything else. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that you will have actual change in policies faster, because we know that a proposal without an actual impact assessment, which will more likely find obstacles in the negotiation process with the Parliament or within the Council. And so again, it has these paradoxical effects, which again, I think calls for engaging very carefully with the question of what are the constraints in the policymaking process, but also if there are new opportunities for actually bringing change. And there was a question previously raised by somebody connected online about implementation of the pact. And I think implementation is something that wasn't there before, at least at the European level, that offers opportunities for actually forcing evidence back into the policy-making process. Because it's not just about the policies, but it's also making sure that you monitor their effects. And if they don't actually have the effects that were intended, then you will have, I think, an opportunity, a hook for them pushing for change again.
Great.
They wish, yeah, hopefully.
Great. Thank you, Albert. I mean, we've had incredibly wide-ranging discussion there, from kind of some of the underlying political dynamics, the representations, the narratives that we see emerging, the counter-narratives that this whole domain of contestation, the real-life on-the-ground implications, decisions that have been made, and bringing them to the end to a discussion of the kind of policy-making process. Some really important and useful points, I think, have been made. So what I'd like to do now is open it up with to Q&A in the room, and also for our online participants. So we have a roving mic. I can see a question at the back. We will gather them. And if you could indicate who the question is to, that'd be helpful, though it could be to the whole panel, so don't feel under any pressure. But we have at the back, so we'll take maybe 3 to start with down the left-hand side of the room, and then we'll come down the right-hand side. So thank you. Please, we'll take 3 questions.
Yes, thank you so much. My name is Virginia Jamfi, and I'm here also on behalf of Center for Migration, Gender and Justice. And I recently founded an initiative called Belonging Beyond Borders Collective. And I wanted to thank the panelists for this really insightful conversation, and it felt reassuring to hear the hard truth of migration. And I wanted to ask a very difficult question, because it feels we are talking. You are an expert in migration, and you have been working for decades on these topics, and also working closely with policymakers. I wanted to ask, how would you measure your impact? Because you've been working so closely with policymakers. I wanted to ask, do they listen? And I wanted to ask if people that are already so close to policymakers and decision makers are telling us this harsh truth of migration, how can we, from the civil society and from the outside, create just the same pressure as we are experiencing from the decision makers? Thank you.
Thank you. And then we had a question here, Luca. Okay, if you could introduce yourself as well.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Luca Lixi from the External Action Service Migration Division. I had a question on the issue of political spin, which I think Mr. Nielsen brought in. And in my experience, a politician always has an agenda, and when there's an agenda, there's a political kind of spin linked to what that agenda is. It could be conscious, it could be unconscious, but and so I had a question relating to, I mean, is there not a difference between a political spin and disinformation? Yeah, because it seems like you were kind of equating the two. Maybe I misunderstood. And the question is, of course, for Mr. Nielsen, but I think also MEP Stoltenberg may have something to say on the experience in terms of political agendas and politicians' way of talking.
I'll make it very brief. I'm Helena Hahn. I'm with the European Policy Center working in the migration program. I'd like to ask a question about something that Alberto mentioned, which is the kind of underlying or very related social and economic questions that often influence and underline migration debates, which is, as people who are, interested and keen on shaping policy debates and influencing them through, on the basis of research and evidence, if at the end of the day, we are talking about socioeconomic questions, we're talking about questions around distributive justice, then how can we incentivize politicians who are, elected for a certain number of years, who maybe have their own agenda? How can we incentivize them effectively to pay attention? Is it about migration, or is it about structural changes that need to be done but are not seen as particularly attractive for politicians? So where do we need to kind of latch on? Do we need to reconsider our starting points for the kind of policy advocacy or recommendations that we do?
Maybe we'll take a question from Martin and then we'll come back for more questions.
Basically, I think whoever works in migration has, as long as you work in migration, a lot of private conversations where you actually face exactly the situation that parents, grandparents, friends, aunts ask questions that are, you need to explain a lot, yeah. And I feel very often then that I take a stand that probably is not the middle that I would like to convey, because I want to be more emphasizing that probably my aunt would also come a bit to the middle, if this is understandable. And now I would like, it was a provocative question actually to the panel, actually, because it's the panel's name is Information Wars. We work with such things in order to attract a panel that people come. And I wonder, because I had this discussion exactly very much around the issue of the topic of externalization, where I found you cannot have a middle stance on it. You cannot have a constructive discussion on it. And there was, and bring also a bit in now the innovate stance with academia. There were some voices in academia that had a bit of a middle stance to it. Not understanding or something like this, but just to clarify what it could be, how it could look like. And I saw then also there was actually also a very critical from other academics on this. Probably don't speak about whom you would and now from the side, but from the other one doesn't matter. But I think, but my point is simply this academic, this middle kind of in the migration debate, I feel is completely lost, and I would really want to know how we get it back without coming into extremes like yeah. To actually to the politics, to the media, and to the think tanks. How can we? How it is not attractive to come with facts. It is not attractive. You don't get a medium to facts. This is it. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Martin. So we've got 4 questions there, which probably could all be meeting in their own rights. I think, but I suppose the whole point is to have a conversation, initiate a discussion about them. And if it, going back, the very first point about, I suppose, achieving impact. And I think so. What I do propose is we go across the panel, picking up the points that seem most relevant to each member of the panel. So perhaps if we start with you, Anna.
Sure.
Yeah, if that's okay.
Yes. Let me see. There are several questions that link to each other, so I'll give a more general answer. I will start with the middle in politics, because yes, I also feel it's lost. If you look at also this parliament, it's very difficult. Last term there were different debates than now. You can see you were the same parties, but you have a different discussion. So that's very difficult, I would say. And what I'm trying to do now, and I see other politicians do the same, is to focus on other elements. So on the return hubs and those deals, we're trying to focus on the money that it costs, that it's not effective, that you're not a trustworthy government if you make these plans, but you cannot do it. The risk is then that you lose the human rights out of sight, but still people care about these topics as well. So also if you have, this also touches upon other points, if you have as a researcher those new angles on it's a waste of money, your government cannot be trusted with the plans that they make, that helps us as well to tell different stories. A little bit less about migration, but more about how the governments are organized. And we can always have a political discussion on where we should go, but it should be fact-based. And this is the problem. It makes it more difficult to have a proper discussion if politicians are willing to let go of the facts. And then you have a real different conversation. So this is something we are struggling with. And therefore, I hope that within the parliament, I'll stick to that, we can find still cooperation with the EPP, which is already more difficult, the Social Democrats, Renew, and the Greens, to have these normal conversations. But let's see how that goes. What to say? So what I can just say, what would help me for pressure and for policy recommendations is those new angles, stories still. We have to give examples. It's maybe a bit silly, but we see that social media has a big effect, and this can help us as well. On social media, we can spread facts, but it's better to tell personal stories. That's why we're also traveling to Bulgaria, to Poland, to hear all those examples. So if you know places where to go, and if you have examples, that would help us a lot.
Sure. I think there was a question about disinformation and political spin. Sometimes, what the commission says is spot on. I remember I have here this quote that from the commission: the biggest gift we can give populists and extremists who argue against immigration is to allow a broken system to remain broken. The rules are not broken. They're not applied properly. And it's time for us to apply the existing rules properly. That was said 10 years ago. So I think for sometimes it's what it says is spot on. I think for me, the disconnect between what is happening and what is said is becoming larger and larger and larger. So, when we talk about the need that the fundamental rights are respected, need to be respected when it comes to people crossing in from Poland, when it comes to the training of the Libyan Coast Guard, which I saw with my own eyes, how they operate 80 nautical miles off the Libyan coast. It's not pretty. I think there's an argument to be made that sometimes the spin is to such a degree that it is disinformation. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, I would love to comment also on this one because I have a few examples of politicians deliberately spreading false information around migration, but also about the recently adopted reforms. But I will refrain from that also because this event is being recorded. I want to, however, comment on the first question about impact and then also briefly on the middle ground. So first on measuring impact. So you can do this in different ways. There are soft indicators and hard indicators. You can sometimes read your own language and the language which is used by policymakers because you've put something in the mind of people. There are also hard indicators that some think tanks use to assess whether they're having an impact on the debate. That's not necessarily how we take things. And I'm just going to mention two aspects that I think are relevant for all researchers who are engaged on these questions. The first is that your impact may not be immediate. You may actually have an impact 3-4 years down the line, simply because the context is not the right one. And I think sometimes researchers underestimate the agenda setting power of research. And we are very keen on instead providing recommendations for the problems of today. I think it's much more important sometimes to anticipate what the problems of tomorrow will be and try to influence the agenda at a much earlier stage. Second point, I think migration policy in particular is an area that cannot survive through research only looking at migration. The example of housing that we discussed before, the discussion on jobs, these are questions that policy makers who are experts on migration or researchers on migration cannot solve on their own. So you will have an impact if you will be able to bridge the gaps with people working in other areas, with policymakers working in different areas. Briefly on the middle ground, that is something that we also face, and you won't be surprised. We are all dealing with a very polarizing environment. However, sometimes it is reassuring to also tell ourselves that our audience is different. Our audience are policymakers. I don't have to convince my household and my relatives, thankfully, about the things that I'm working on a day-to-day basis. And quite frankly, sometimes the institutions, it's a metaphor, but sometimes the institutions also try to somehow shape public discourse in a way that I don't think befits their role and their mandate. But that is a complicated question that more relates to narratives. However, what you said, I think, is very, very important, because I think the fact that the middle ground is being squeezed is also having an effect on the funding opportunities that organizations that are interested in pushing for balanced and evidence-based solutions are able to work with. And I think we are heading to 5 years where funding for civil society organizations, for think tanks that don't embrace necessarily the most extreme positions will likely reduce. And I think we collectively have a responsibility to not only recognize this fact, but also to build bridges between ourselves and work as partners. And so thanks again for the invitation, because I think through the INNOVATE project, perhaps there will be more opportunities to do so.
Yeah, there certainly will, because we're only just beginning this project. But we have some questions. I mean, I think we can run over a little bit because it's very interesting and a bit more people want to have a say. So we did have some questions online, and Eurus is going to, I think, maybe not, will bring us some questions from our online audience.
There is an interesting question from our online participant, Odilia Abreu. And the question is, how is artificial intelligence influencing disinformation surrounding migration narratives? Additionally, how can civil society build effective counter-narratives to challenge the growing influence of far-right political forces, whose proposals often rely on hostility and promote hate speech against immigrants?
Thank you. We've also got questions in the So I think we have a at the back. We've got 3 more and then we'll close. So if you could keep them relatively concise as well, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this insightful. My name is Lee Zulut, and Senior Associate Researcher at Brussels School of Governance and founder of Heartwarmingly. So my question is precisely what, because in the first discussion we spoke about the role of evidence, facts, research that is well done and accurate. And in this session, we arrive speaking about disinformation and the role of emotions. So the question for the panel is, to which extent the researchers or those who produce evidence should engage with the emotion or shouldn't? And what's your take on that?
Florent Rauner from the Brussels School of Governance at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. I have a question that may link a bit the first panel discussion to this one about the role of researchers. And I mean, the researchers try to search for, you know, a very refined line of argument often, but what's happening if they're thrown into a disinformation warfare themselves? For instance, if they make press releases and then only part of their information is taken out and used in a way that does not at all reflect what they actually wanted to say in the research project as such. Do you have any advice on how to basically engage ideally in such a debate that is not really looking at exchanging of arguments and convincing the others, but just to speak to their own bubble, the most extreme way?
Thank you. And Basha? So the final question.
Basha Gauchon from Migration Policy Group. Thank you very much for this panel. And I have a question for Anna, heavily inspired by the debate, of course, this great debate. And I'm going to be echoing some of the issues that Alberto has raised, because we're probably facing the similar challenges when it comes to trying to influence policy, and that is how this disinformation has changed the agenda, and we find it difficult to insert influence now. Historically, MPG has been doing, has it easy when it comes to influencing policy on integration, anti-discrimination, but now we see more and more the debate shifting more towards irregular movements, border security, returns, where we also do research, where we also join the meetings, we also raise our voice on how about legal pathways, how about human rights. But I want to ask you how you communicate with the middle ground, what kind of narratives you use. I was recently in a debate with MEPs from the Christian Democrats, the European People's Party, and all I could hear from them was, and we can communicate, and we share many similar positions, and we could always communicate on integration matters, for instance. But all I could hear from them is the concern that if we don't cover these things, like if we are not very careful and we are not giving a very an impression of like being very strict on return, then the far right is going to take this issue. And so, knowing this constraint, how do we make sure that we shift the agenda back to all the other issues, and what would you recommend? So maybe it's a big question, but.
Great. So if we go across the panel again, if it's okay to start with you again, Anna, is that right?
Yes, and I will answer the last question. I fully recognize this. You see in a lot of countries and in the European Parliament that the more reasonable parties want to shift to the right because they're afraid that the topic will get hijacked by others. I'll be honest with you. I don't know if we can shift it back. I don't know if that's going to happen in the near future, and if that is the tactic, the way to go. Maybe we have to find a way, how can we cool off the whole debate and make it a bit more silent so we can work through the back, making sure that the Commission does their job to still achieve the things we want to do. What I see happening now in the Netherlands, for example, we had this whole, the last national campaign was about migration, and it was the Liberal Party that said, we will talk about migration, and then the far right won. Now what you see happening is that they're not trying to touch the topic anymore. They're focusing on security, on other topics. So what I hope is that we kind of let the topic go a bit and we focus on other things, so it's not so heated anymore. What we see now in other debates on migration, for example, labor migration, all the national governments say we need migrants because we're an aging society, but we don't want to be the front runners on this topic right now, because then we will lose it. So that's why I hope if we can keep the debates a bit out of the media and then we do it more on that way, we can achieve something. So maybe it's not about winning debate back, but about letting it cool off and then finding our ways in again.
Thank you. Nikolai?
Sure. I'm not sure if the question is addressed to me. I'm just a journalist. So, but when it comes to AI and disinformation, I mean, that's obviously something that's very scary, at least for me anyways. In my work, I just try to report the facts as best as I can. Try to draw some sort of critical remarks in it by experts, possibly some of you sitting here in the audience, actually, and then try to stimulate a wider public debate on some of these issues that is grounded in reality. And when I have those opportunities, I like to just link what the decisions that are being made here in Brussels to what's happening on the ground. So that takes me to some places as well, which is also vital. But as journalists, I think our task is to sort of hold the powerful to account and hopefully stir a debate. Thanks.
Yeah, all of them interesting questions, but we are pressed with time and I'm lucky enough to be the last one after the previous two speakers have already commented. So just very quickly on AI, it's a vastly under-researched area because we are seeing AI developing. And so what I can share is that the audio-visual content of false material which is generated by AI triggers a different kind of emotional and psychological response on those who come across it. And we have been talking about narratives that are fairly easy to spread through text. And so if you talk about statistics and these kind of things, and that's been the dominant mechanism and strategy used by disinformation actors. Because AI generates different kind of responses, then these will likely have an impact, but it's not very clear what it will be. The second element to this discussion is that AI makes it fairly cheap to produce disinformation. And this is perhaps the most worrying aspect because sometimes we assume that the goal of disinformation actors is to necessarily determine what the content of the public debate is, but oftentimes it is instead to just create confusion in the public. And if you can imagine the magnitude of the seismic change that having cheap disinformation produced at very high volumes on a day-to-day basis, which people come across, even if they don't necessarily believe it, this will lead to a lot of confusion, making very complicated to stimulate an evidence-based and balanced discussion on this topic. Just very quickly on emotions, this is what I was referring to before in a way. I think there are sectors and professions that I think have a responsibility to consider the role of emotions in narratives. I just think that sometimes the institutions have taken it upon themselves to also somehow use emotions to communicate with the public, but then inevitably they face constraints because, among others, they are not considered a trusted messenger for that kind of content. And so again, I think it's very important. There are plenty of studies that show the importance of emotions, but I think, again, you need to do it properly. Not anybody can do it.
Thank you. So I'd like to, we're going to have to bring the panel discussion to a close now, but I thank all our panelists and the members of the audience for the great questions. So if you join me in thanking everybody, please.
Yes. And I'm very sorry, I have to run out because I'm negotiating now a file on labor regulation, but EPP shifting. Something that we didn't happen is happening. I have to run to save the vote. Sorry.
Great.
Thank you.
And so that goes back earlier about achieving impact. So a nice way to round things off there. So before we finish, what I wanted to do was just on behalf of the project team, thank everybody for coming today. But this is a project where we're not here today to present final results. We're here to present work that's ongoing. And so our kind of message is if you are interested in learning find out about the project, to keep in touch with us. Our easy to remember URL, migrationresearchpolicy.eu, tells you all about what we're doing, how you can work with us, cooperate and share your insights with us. Also, we'd be massively grateful if you could do an evaluation of this event, because we're going to organize a lot of events where we try to engage with people and build engagement. So we have to try and learn ourselves about what works, what could be done better, how we can improve what we're trying to do, because we're going to be organizing a lot of activities over the next couple of years sometimes around very specific issues, sometimes presenting new evidence on how engagement affects people at a more kind of emotional level, as one of the questions that was just been posed has put to us. So please feel free to engage with us. And if you can provide us any feedback, then the QR code there allows you to do so. And we really appreciate it if you could take, it's like 1 minute. It's a very short survey, or could be longer if you have a lot to say, because there's a couple of open questions. So yeah, it could take you hours if I was to be really honest about it. Yeah, well, I think that brings to an end today's event. What we're going to offer refreshments in the, well, you'll see when you leave the room, it's in front of you. So we'll be very happy if you could join us. And yeah, as we say on there, keep in touch with us. So thank you very much for coming along today. Thank you.